Ah, if only you knew the things I saw during that war. People often don't believe me when I tell them. They think the old man's gone mad, that the war ate away at my sanity. But I swear to you, it's the absolute truth. It was the most terrifying experience of my life, and I've seen plenty of horrors in war. We all knew the Nazis were evil. Everyone understood that, concentration camps, mass executions. But what we discovered that winter in the Ardennes forest went beyond anything human comprehension could grasp. It was after the Normandy landings, summer of 1944. My God, what a nightmare that was. We landed on Omaha Beach as part of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 82nd Airborne Division. That day, the ground itself seemed to tremble beneath our boots. The Germans greeted us with a storm of fire. People think you're a hero in battle, charging forward bravely. But no. Mostly, you're just trying not to die. We lost people so fast, it was impossible to keep count. Artillery, machine guns, mines. There were 10 of us in our squad, and by the end of the landing, only 4 remained. 4, son. I still remember the faces of those who didn't make it off that beach. After Normandy, the brass didn't cut us any slack. The Army always treats paratroopers like expendable assets. That's just the way it is. By December that year, we were sent to the Ardennes. Rumors were flying about German infiltrators wiping out our patrols. Our mission was mostly reconnaissance, to figure out where our people were disappearing to and what the hell was going on out there. Some said it was just clever German tactics. Others spoke of saboteurs disguised as allies. But there were whispers too. Whispers of something inhuman happening in that forest. We laughed it off, of course. Just war front tales, we thought. That winter was brutal. The cold bit so hard it felt like your face would crack, and the snow was deep, like something out of a devil's dream. We had 2 vehicles, an Army Dodge truck and a Willys Jeep. We loaded up the Dodge with ammunition, a radio, some rations, and of course weapons. The Jeep carried Harper's sniper rifle and grenades, anything we thought might come in handy in the woods. The roads were icy, treacherous. Tires skidded, engines strained. We passed through villages that looked deserted. Windows boarded up, doors locked, and not a soul in sight. Ruined houses, frozen fields, just emptiness everywhere. By evening, we reached a small village called Spieldorf. Tiny place, maybe 20 houses, a little church with a bell tower, and an old mill that hadn't worked in years. The locals weren't exactly thrilled to see us. They watched us with suspicion, as if we might bring more trouble than help. The village elder, a frail old man who looked like he was carved from oak, stood before us with his head bowed. We asked him about the Germans. Had he seen or heard anything? He just shrugged, mumbling that he hadn't seen anyone and didn't know anything. Honestly, he looked like he was hiding something. That's when Lieutenant Crane ordered him to provide us with a guide to take us through the area. Reluctantly, grumbling under his breath, the elder called for his son. The boy couldn't have been more than 17. Skinny as a rail, his face marked with small scars, probably from farm work. His eyes darted nervously, and he fidgeted like he wanted to be anywhere but there. But he didn't dare refuse. His father had spoken. We set out. At first, we followed a beaten path through snow-covered fields, where stunted trees stretched toward the gray sky like skeletal fingers. The boy walked ahead, trying to stay calm, but I noticed him glancing at the forest from time to time, like he was expecting something. It got to me. I caught up to him and walked beside him. "Why so jumpy? What are you scared of?" I asked. He hesitated, pressing his lips together before whispering, like he was afraid someone might overhear.
"There's a monster in the forest. Huge. Terrifying. They say it hunts outsiders. That's why I'm scared."
I just waved him off. Stories, kid. Just old village tales about wolves and ghosts and curses. People love spinning that kind of stuff, especially during war. Sure, the forest felt eerie, but I wasn't about to start believing in monsters. We kept moving. Eventually, we reached an old church. Stone walls, somber and grim, with a tall bell tower that seemed to pierce the gray sky. The roof sagged in places. The windows were caked with grime, but the building still commanded respect. What it was doing in the middle of the forest, I'll never know. We stopped and got out of the vehicles. The lieutenant decided we should check it out. While the others secured the perimeter, I kept an eye on the boy. He stood by the road, clutching his hat, clearly reluctant to go inside. The moment we entered the church, the smell of damp and decay hit us. The floor was cold stone, the walls lined with old, cracked frescoes. The central altar looked like it hadn't been touched in ages, but something strange caught my eye. On one wall, there was a carving of a wolf's head. It was so detailed it almost seemed alive. What does this mean? I thought, studying the intricate design. While we searched the room, a shout echoed through the church.
"Hey guys, over here, you gotta see this."
It was Mike. We rushed to his voice and found him standing by a heavy wooden door in the corner, slightly ajar. Behind it, stairs descended into darkness.
"Looks like a stash,"
said McKinley. We went down into the basement. Flashlights revealed a small cache, boxes of supplies, weapons, even ammunition. It was clear the Germans had been using the place as a base. Everything was neatly arranged, like they were planning to come back. It was a saboteur's hideout. That's when we knew this wasn't a game anymore. There could be enemies nearby. The lieutenant ordered us to take everything we could carry. Rifles, grenades, food. We loaded it all onto the truck. Each of us understood. If the Germans were really out here, this was only the beginning. As we prepared to head back to the village, I kept my eyes on the boy. His face was pale as the snow, his eyes wide like a trapped animal. He knew something none of us did. We were finishing loading the supplies as dusk began to settle. The shadows in the forest grew longer, and the air seemed to grow heavier with every passing minute. The boy who had led us here was getting visibly more nervous. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, glancing between us and the forest, as if ready to bolt at the slightest provocation. I noticed how he kept fidgeting with his cap, his eyes darting toward the trees as though he could see something we couldn't. "Come on, guys, let's move it," I called out to the squad. "Night's almost here, time to head back." No one argued. We quickly finished up, piled into the vehicles, and set off toward the village. The forest grew darker by the second, and even the snow, which normally seemed to glow under moonlight, now looked gray and dull. The boy sat next to me in the front seat. I could feel his body trembling slightly, and it made me uneasy, though I couldn't quite say why. By the time we got back to the village, it was full night. Moonlight bathed the rooftops, and mist began creeping over the hills, spilling into the streets like a living thing. As soon as we stopped, the boy jumped out of the truck and bolted toward his house as if something unseen was chasing him. We all just exchanged puzzled looks.
"What's his problem?"
Mike asked, watching the kid disappear into the shadows. "Beats me. Probably just nerves. War'll do that to anyone," I replied, though I wasn't convinced that was the whole story. A few minutes later, the elder appeared. His expression was grim, but when he saw the supplies, a flicker of relief crossed his face. We kept what we needed and gave the rest to the village. It was clear they were starving. You could see it in their hollow cheeks and gaunt faces. The elder called out to the villagers, and slowly, hesitantly, they emerged from their homes. Women clung to their children who peeked out from behind their skirts while the men stood off to the side, silent and watchful, as though afraid of the dark. As we handed out the food, I stepped over to the elder. "What's going on here? Why is everyone so scared?" I asked, not really expecting a straight answer. The elder looked at me from under his brows, his voice dropping to a near whisper, as if he was afraid the wrong ears might hear him.
"There's a beast roaming these parts, a strange one,"
he began.
"Not long ago it killed one of ours, a shepherd. He was returning from the fields in the evening. By morning we found his body near the village, or what was left of it."
The elder crossed himself.
"God help us. His body was so torn up we could barely recognize him. Some say it's a wolf, but I don't believe that."
He called over one of the men, a wiry fellow with sharp features and hands that looked like they were made for swinging an axe or digging trenches. Hans, I think his name was. He came reluctantly, each step seeming an effort. His face was pale and his eyes glistened with tension.
"Tell them,"
the elder ordered. Hans hesitated, staring at the ground, then raised his head and began to speak. His voice trembled as he recounted his tale.
"I saw it. The thing that did this. It was last week. I was coming back from the woods. It was getting dark. I was walking along the path when I heard footsteps. At first, I thought it was someone from the village, but then I saw it."
He stopped, struggling to find his words. We all waited, holding our breath.
"It was big, like a man, but not a man. It moved between the trees, hunched over, its arms so long they almost touched the ground. Its fur was black as coal, and its eyes..."
He shuddered.
"Its eyes glowed, red like embers in a fire. It looked at me, and I couldn't move. I thought my heart would stop, and then it just turned and disappeared into the forest."
Hans fell silent, his breathing ragged. We glanced at each other, unsure of what to say. Mike finally broke the tension with a nervous laugh.
What a load of crap,
he muttered. But his grin was forced, and I could see the unease in his eyes. As for me, I couldn't stop turning it over in my mind. What could it have been? A wolf? Germans pulling some kind of trick? Or something else entirely? Something beyond reason? The guys and I exchanged glances after Hans finished his story. Sure, it sounded terrifying, but we were soldiers, used to chalking things up to local panic or an overactive imagination. Forests, war, cold. They can all play tricks on a person's mind. We decided it was just one of those tales, though deep down, each of us carried a nagging sliver of doubt. That night, we posted guards, rotating them every 2 hours. No fires, just the silence of the woods and the occasional rustle of branches in the wind. The night passed without incident, but our sleep was uneasy, each of us feeling as though unseen eyes were watching. At dawn, we rose early. The snow had hardened overnight, and the frost gripped the ground like iron. We ate quickly, checked our weapons, and the lieutenant ordered us to continue the search. Our objective was clear: comb through the forest and figure out where the Germans might be hiding. The elder pointed us toward areas where patrols had vanished but refused to leave the village himself. His son didn't even poke his head out of the house. We moved in a single file, keeping a tight formation. The forest was dense, each step crunching in the frozen snow, the sound echoing in the eerie stillness. Our breath formed clouds of steam, and every shadow cast by the trees seemed suspicious. Yet hour after hour we found nothing. No signs of the enemy, no sign of any beast. The lieutenant divided our search into grid patterns, and we proceeded methodically, like we were back in training. By late afternoon, the sun was already sinking, and Kowalski, our medic, muttered,
"It's getting colder."
He gripped his rifle tighter.
I don't like this.
We shrugged it off. Winter was winter. As evening fell and we made our way back to the vehicles, a sudden shout broke the silence.
Hey, guys, over here!
It was Mike. We pushed through the underbrush toward his voice and found him standing near a low hill. The snow there was churned up, stained dark with something that looked disturbingly like blood. I stepped closer and saw it, a body. It was a German soldier, or at least what was left of him. His face was torn beyond recognition, his chest split open as if ripped apart by claws. Blood had frozen into dark, crusty patches on his uniform. We stood in stunned silence, staring at the body, our minds reeling.
What could have done this?
Harper asked, his eyes darting nervously. His hand trembled against his rifle's trigger. I knelt down to examine the wounds. They weren't from bullets or knives. This was something else. Something savage.
A wolf?
Mike muttered, though he didn't sound convinced. The tracks around the body made it worse. Large paw prints, but oddly shaped, almost like they belonged to something walking on two legs. The trail led deeper into the forest, into shadows none of us wanted to enter.
Damn it.
The lieutenant cursed.
If it's an animal, it's huge. And if it's Germans, where's the rest of them? How did this guy end up like this?
We searched the area, trying to piece together what happened. Had the soldier gotten separated from his unit? Were the Germans nearby, watching us even now? But the villagers' stories, Hans's description of the beast, nagged at us. Fear crept into our group. Even the most skeptical among us began to wonder, what if Hans was right? What if this wasn't just an animal? Something about the whole situation felt off. Wrong in a way none of us could explain. The lieutenant made the call.
We're heading back to the village. Mark this location on the map. We'll deal with it tomorrow in daylight. I'm not risking my men over whatever did this.
As we trudged back, the forest seemed to close in around us, the trees looming larger, their shadows darker. The feeling that something unseen was following us, watching us, grew stronger with each step. We arrived at the village in silence, the weight of what we'd seen heavy on all of us. Inside, the air was tense, thick like the fog that clung to the ground outside. Fighting men is one thing. You know they think, they act within reason. But this was something else. Something that shattered the normal order of things. The men prepared a simple meal, canned stew and bread, but there was little conversation. Most of it was muttered complaints about wanting to finish this job and get out of here. Even Bill, who could never resist cracking jokes, sat silently, absent-mindedly prying open a tin with his knife. When the food was ready, we finally gathered around the table. An old lantern hung from a hook overhead, casting long, wavering shadows on the walls. Just as we began to eat, there was a knock at the door. It was urgent, rapid. We froze. The sentries were posted at the village's edge. No one should have been able to approach unnoticed. That meant it had to be one of the villagers. The lieutenant nodded at me, and I went to the door, cautiously sliding back the bolt. A woman stood there, her face pale, her hair disheveled, and her eyes glistening with tears. She was trembling, not from the cold, but from some inner terror. I recognized her immediately. She was one of the villagers who had quietly stood aside when we handed out supplies earlier.
"Help! Please, help!"
she cried, her voice breaking into sobs. She clasped her hands as though in prayer and dropped to her knees. I reached out to steady her. "What happened?" I asked, my tone calm, despite the knot forming in my stomach.
"My husband, Willam. He didn't come back. He went out to the fields to find food, whatever was left of the harvest. I told him not to go. The elder forbid it. But he's so stubborn. He said he'd bring back potatoes, anything. But he never returned. I waited and waited.
Her voice faltered, and she began to cry again. Mike frowned from across the room.
Why didn't you tell the elder?
She looked up, her tear-streaked face filled with despair.
The elder forbade anyone from leaving the village. He said it wasn't safe, that the forest, that it's dangerous. But my husband wouldn't listen. I tried to stop him, I swear.
We exchanged uneasy glances. None of us wanted to go back out there. We were exhausted, hungry, and the forest had already taken a toll on our nerves. But how could we turn away from a woman pleading for help? That wasn't who we were. The lieutenant turned to me.
Jack, what do you think?
I nodded. Mike, Bill, gear up. We're going. The woman's face lit with hope as she watched us prepare. Mike grabbed a carbine, Bill took a machine gun, and I double-checked my Thompson and spare magazines. She told us where her husband had gone, and with that, we stepped back into the night. The forest beyond the village was even more menacing at night. The moonlight barely pierced the clouds, and the trees cast long, claw-like shadows over the ground. We walked in tense silence, each of us scanning every movement in the dark. The occasional rustle or snap of a branch set our nerves on edge. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted, a sound that felt unnaturally loud in the stillness. The woman had said her husband went to an old potato field, now buried under snow. She believed he'd been digging there, desperate to find something edible. We followed her directions, our unease growing with every step. Each of us felt the suffocating weight of the forest around us, the creeping sense that we were not alone. We reached the spot after half an hour on the road. The dirt path we followed was dusted with a thin layer of snow, winding its way through frozen fields that hadn't seen a farmer's touch in years. Stalks of corn jutted out of the ground like rusty bayonets piercing the icy crust. The forest loomed at the edges of the field, a wall of black that seemed alive with shadows shifting behind every tree. We walked in silence, glancing around nervously, gripping our weapons tighter than usual. Leading the group, I raised my hand to signal a halt. Spread out. Keep your eyes sharp. If he's here, we're finding him. We fanned out across the field, combing through the frozen ground, brittle bushes and skeletal remains of plants. The icy air bit into our lungs, and every crunch of snow underfoot seemed loud enough to wake the dead. The silence was oppressive, as if the world itself was holding its breath, watching us. Then, out of nowhere, a scream. It was distant but unmistakable, raw, guttural, and torn from someone's throat. We froze. Instinctively, everyone raised their weapons.
You hear that?
Mike asked, his voice low. No one replied, but the look in everyone's eyes said it all. The scream came again, closer this time. Mike motioned with his hand.
That way.
We broke into a run, forming a loose line as we surged toward the sound. Suddenly a roar ripped through the stillness, something between a man and a beast, a deep resonant sound that sent chills racing up my spine. I glanced back and saw Bill gripping his rifle so hard his knuckles turned white.
What the hell was that?
He whispered. No one answered. The roar came again, this time closer. It was coming from the direction we were heading. We quickened our pace, darting from one patch of cover to the next, the snowfall thickening around us, blinding us to anything more than a few feet away. Then we saw it. Movement in the snow. Someone was crawling, dragging themselves forward, leaving a trail of blood behind them. We raised our weapons, eyes fixed on the figure. "Hold your fire!" I called out when I realized it was a man. We rushed to him, and there he was, a man in his 40s, drenched in blood, his face twisted in terror. This was who we were looking for. His name was Willam.
God, what happened to you?
Bill asked, crouching beside him. Willam didn't respond. He wheezed, struggling to breathe. His legs were mangled, shredded to the bone as if some massive beast had torn into him. Deep gashes crisscrossed his chest, his shirt soaked in blood. But it was his eyes that haunted me most. Wild, unseeing, as if staring into some unspeakable abyss. We lifted him quickly. Mike and Bill took his arms while I stayed on guard, scanning the tree line, my finger tight on the trigger. The air felt heavier, the shadows deeper. The snow muffled everything except the pounding of my heart. And then we heard it again. That same roar, closer than ever. "Move! Now!" I barked. We quickened our pace, practically dragging Willam as he moaned in pain. My heart hammered in my chest. Then, in the distance, I caught movement, a silhouette. Something massive was tearing through the snow and brush, heading straight for us. It was huge, tall, broad, but I couldn't make out the details in the chaos. A wolf's muzzle, a hunched back. It moved like something ripped straight out of a nightmare. I raised my Thompson and let loose a burst of fire, shouting, "Go! Get him out of here!" The bullet sang through the air, and the thing stopped. It let out a roar so powerful the ground seemed to tremble. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it turned and vanished into the darkness, swallowed by the forest. I caught up with the others. Willam was barely conscious, leaving a crimson trail in the snow as we carried him. We kept glancing back, expecting that thing to return at any moment. When the lights of the village finally came into view, I let out a shaky breath of relief. We brought him to the safe house, laying him on an old table we'd turned into a makeshift operating station. As we worked to bind his wounds, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there wasn't done with us. Not yet. The house erupted into chaos, buzzing like a disturbed hive. The others crowded around us, throwing questions from every direction. What happened? What's wrong with him? Where's all this blood from? Words didn't come easily. I just stood there, gripping my Thompson, staring at a fixed point, the roar of that thing still echoing in my ears. Willam lay on the table, groaning, while our medic, Kowalski, was already working to stop the bleeding.
What was it?
Thomas asked, his voice uncharacteristically tense, devoid of its usual cheer. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, and finally muttered, "There was something out there, something big. Not human. It was coming straight for us. I opened fire, it backed off, but we don't know where it went." The room fell so silent you could hear the floorboards creak under our boots. Mike added grimly,
It's not a wolf, and it's not human, it's something else.
Those words hung in the air like frost, sending shivers through the room. Even Thomas, ever the joker, turned pale. The lieutenant glanced at us, his face etched with worry, but he quickly composed himself.
We need to finish this and get the hell out of here. No more dragging this out.
Not long after, Willam's wife arrived with the village elder. The moment she saw her husband, broken and bleeding on the table, she collapsed onto him, sobbing.
"I told him not to go. I told him,"
she repeated through her tears, clutching his chest. The elder, on the other hand, stayed rooted to the spot, hesitant to come closer. His face was ashen, his lips trembling. He knew. He knew what kind of creature we had encountered, and he understood the danger it posed. The next day we rose early, though none of us had truly slept. The night had dragged on endlessly, with every creak of the old house setting our nerves on edge. We regrouped to plan the next move. A young man, the elder's son, volunteered to guide us. He looked torn as if caught between the urge to help and the overwhelming desire to hide.
I know a place.
He said quietly, avoiding our eyes.
Near the mountain, there's a cave. We might find something there.
The lieutenant decided it was worth investigating, and we set out. The road to the cave was grueling. Frozen ground, tangled underbrush, steep inclines. We moved slowly, driving 2 vehicles. The jeep led the way, forging a path. The young man sat beside me, pointing out the route with trembling hands. None of us spoke. Words felt unnecessary, even intrusive. By the time we reached the cave, the sun was already dipping below the horizon. The place had an unsettling air about it. A jagged fissure in the rock, surrounded by dead trees whose twisted branches stretched skyward like skeletal hands in silent plea. Near the entrance, we spotted tracks, massive paw prints like the ones we'd seen before near the German's body, mixed with boot marks.
Stay sharp,
the lieutenant ordered, and we raised our weapons. The atmosphere was thick with tension, every step echoing unnaturally. We ventured inside, the darkness swallowing us whole. Only the faint beams of our flashlights pierced the gloom, illuminating uneven walls etched with strange, clawed symbols. The cave ran deep, the air growing colder and carrying a metallic tang that mingled with the damp, a smell unmistakably reminiscent of blood. Then our flashlights revealed a larger chamber ahead. What we saw froze us in place. Scattered around the room were shattered crates, stamped with German military markings. Equipment lay strewn across the ground, radios, tools, and strange containers. We found maps and hastily scribbled notes in German. Corporal Rivers skimmed through them, his face darkening as he read. Experiments. They were conducting experiments here. Something unnatural. The signs of chaos were everywhere. Overturned crates, pools of dried blood, torn scraps of clothing.
They left in a hurry.
Bill observed grimly.
But why? And where to?
I scanned the floor. The massive paw prints were there, interwoven with the soldiers' boot marks. Whatever they had brought here had escaped, or been set loose. The deeper we delved, the more oppressive the realization became. Something terrible had happened in this place. The Germans had lost control over whatever they had brought, or perhaps they'd never truly understood it to begin with. Whatever it was beyond their science, beyond their strength. And now, it was loose in the wild. Bill suddenly called out, crouched next to an overturned crate.
Hey guys, take a look at this.
Pulling a bundle of papers from a metal case. The pages were yellowed and torn in places, but most of the text was still legible. They were written in German. Corporal Rivers grabbed the papers, sat on the edge of the broken crate, and began translating with a furrowed brow. We gathered around him, shining our flashlights onto the fragile sheets, listening intently. I don't remember every detail, but the gist of it was chilling. What the documents revealed. First entry, 1940. An expedition to the north in Sweden was commissioned by High Command. The objective was to investigate ancient legends about wolves capable of transforming into humans. Archaeologists discovered a cave on an island in the Baltic Sea. Inside, they uncovered an ancient burial site containing the remains of an enormous wolf. Nearby were strange amulets and ritualistic artifacts. Inscriptions in an ancient language referenced a beast guardian, a spirit said to possess humans. Second entry, 1941. The bones and artifacts from the burial site were transported to a research laboratory. Scientists discovered traces of organic material preserved within the remains despite their age. Experiments began to understand the connection between the spirit or force and the remains. Initially, they attempted to interact with it using chemical methods, creating serums derived from bone and blood extracts. Third entry, 1942. The first test subjects were animals, dogs, wolves, and other predators exposed to the serum. Some exhibited increased strength and aggression. However, most died in agony, unable to withstand the effects. Few experiments showed success, though there were strange signs of awakening in some of the animals. Fourth entry, 1943. Under orders to accelerate the research, human trials began. Volunteers included prisoners of war and SS soldiers. The results were terrifying. Some subjects gained immense strength and endurance, but most lost their humanity. They transformed into aggressive creatures entirely out of control. Several soldiers and scientists were killed by the test subjects. Fifth entry, 1944. After numerous failures, a breakthrough was achieved. One subject, named Fenrir, retained human form, but could transform into something resembling a wolf, with extraordinary strength and speed. However, controlling him remained an issue. During transformations, he became ferociously aggressive, attacking even his handlers. Final entry. By late 1944, plans were made to transport the laboratory, along with Fenrir and key scientists, westward, away from the advancing front lines. The records end here. It seems this cave was a waypoint during the relocation. Something unforeseen must have happened here. When Rivers finished reading, the cave fell into an oppressive silence. I glanced at Bill, who was gripping the stock of his rifle tightly.
You're telling me this is what we're up against?
He muttered.
Seems like it.
Rivers replied quietly, flipping through the pages as if hoping to find answers that weren't there.
They were trying to create something they shouldn't have, and clearly, they lost control.
We looked around the chamber. Broken equipment was strewn everywhere. Radios, tools, metal crates, stamped with German insignias. But the most unnerving sight was a massive cage. Its iron bars were thick, but they had been bent outward as if ripped apart by sheer force. Blood stained the floor and walls, evidence of a brutal struggle.
They left in a hurry,
Mike said, gesturing to the boot prints scattered across the floor. But alongside the boots were paw prints, massive deep impressions in the dirt. The real question isn't where they went, I said, gripping my weapon tightly. It's where that thing went. We exchanged uneasy glances. Each of us understood the grim reality. Whatever this creature was, it was still out there, somewhere in the woods. We gathered all the documents and carefully packed them along with other equipment that might prove important. These papers could explain a lot to Command, if we ever got out of here alive. We loaded the crates, gear, and anything valuable into our vehicles. Rivers packed the records into a separate case with care, and the lieutenant ordered us to contact HQ via radio. The signal was faint, but we managed to relay the critical information. Reinforcements, a team of engineers, and scouts were scheduled to arrive the next day to assess the situation. Command seemed concerned about our reports, but they clearly didn't grasp the gravity of what we'd encountered. To them, it was just another wartime mission. We knew better. This was something far worse. Once the packing was done, it was time to head back. The silence in the forest grew heavier with each passing moment, as if something was waiting just out of sight, behind every tree. Judging by the evidence we'd found in the cave, the Germans had suffered severe losses, likely falling victim to their own nightmarish experiments. But the unsettling question remained. Where were they now? That thought gnawed at all of us. By the time we returned to the village, dusk was settling in. We immediately set up a stronger perimeter, knowing the night would bring danger. 2 men were stationed at the village outskirts, and another pair guarded our base. For the first time in what felt like hours, I let out a breath when we heard that Willam, our injured survivor, had regained consciousness. His wife, tears streaming down her face, said he had begun to speak. Willam looked terrible, pale, trembling, but his eyes were wide and alert. He spoke in a hoarse, rasping voice, like a man who had stared into the abyss.
"I was out in the field,"
he began, each word seemingly costing him great effort.
"looking for potatoes, just something to get us through another day. At first, everything seemed quiet. But then I heard footsteps. Not animals. People."
We exchanged glances as Willam clung to his wife's hand as if she might vanish.
"It was the Germans. A whole squad. They surrounded me, pointed their guns. They shouted something about Americans, wanted to know where you were, demanded I bring them supplies from the village. I told them I didn't know anything, that I was just a farmer."
He broke into a coughing fit but pressed on.
"Then one of them pulled out a pistol. He was going to execute me. I closed my eyes, waiting for it to end. But then I heard it. That sound.
His eyes widened and his voice dropped to a whisper.
A roar, something came out of the darkness. It moved so fast, none of them could react. It tore into one of them, then another. All I saw was blood, teeth, claws. They screamed, fired their guns, but the bullets didn't stop it."
We stood frozen, the weight of his story settling over us like a death shroud. Each of us felt a chill crawling under our skin.
"It came for me too,"
Willam continued, motioning to his mangled legs.
"Ripped into me. I thought I was dead. But then it turned back to them. They were screaming and I crawled. I crawled as fast as I could. It didn't even notice. I don't know where it went. Everything disappeared into the darkness."
His account left us all shaken. The room fell silent except for Willam's labored breathing and the faint crackle of the lamp. The lieutenant rubbed his face, clearly trying to process the situation.
That means the enemy is still here. The Germans are still close. And so is that creature.
Mike let out a nervous chuckle, though there was no humor in it.
Great. Nazis and a monster hunting everyone down. Hell of a vacation spot we picked.
We were still discussing Willam's story when the night exploded with the crack of a gunshot. One loud report, then another. The sound shattered the quiet, and we all froze for a split second before instinct took over. Grabbing our weapons, we rushed to the door as the lieutenant shouted,
"Weapons ready, positions."
I grabbed my Thompson and followed the others outside. Under the pale moonlight, we saw our sentries. One of them, Jim, was on the ground clutching his side, blood seeping through his fingers. Kowalski was kneeling beside him, trying to staunch the bleeding. The other, Walker, stood trembling, his rifle aimed at the forest.
"What happened?"
The lieutenant barked as he approached.
There was someone out there."
Walker stammered, his eyes fixed on the tree line.
"Germans. They came out of the woods. We didn't have time."
Another burst of gunfire erupted from the forest, forcing us to dive for cover.
"Positions, spread out,"
the lieutenant shouted. I took cover behind a broken cart while Mike and Bill crouched near the house. Rivers positioned himself behind some barrels covered in snow, his rifle trained on the forest. Shadowy figures began emerging from the trees. Germans, moving cautiously but clearly preparing for an attack. Bullets tore through the air, striking the walls and ground around us.
"Light them up,"
the lieutenant yelled. I pressed my cheek against the Thompson stock and unleashed a burst at one of the silhouettes. He dropped, but two more took his place, using the trees for cover. Mike, our sharpshooter, fired twice, and I saw another German clutch his chest before collapsing.
"There's too many of them,"
Thomas shouted, laying down suppressive fire with his bar. The snow exploded around the advancing Germans, forcing some to dive for cover. We could hear their muffled orders as they regrouped. Another volley of gunfire tore through our defenses, splintering wood and sending debris flying.
Grenades! Who's got grenades?
Thomas yelled. Bill tossed him one, and Thomas lobbed it into the trees. The explosion lit up the night, throwing snow and shards of bark into the air. A scream rang out, followed by a brief silence.
They're pulling back,
Mike said, peering through his scope.
No, they're regrouping,
The lieutenant corrected.
Hold your positions.
Then from the left flank, a panicked scream cut through the night.
They're flanking us,
Rivers shouted. We quickly shifted to cover the barn's side, the Germans pressing their advantage. Their numbers were greater, but they hadn't expected such fierce resistance. We fired relentlessly, holding them at bay. As I unleashed another burst, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, something fast and low darting through the trees. My stomach dropped. "What the hell was that?" I shouted, but no one answered. Willam's story played in my mind like a haunting echo. What if it wasn't just the Germans out there? The firefight raged on. One German soldier managed to get close under cover of fire. He raised his rifle, but Bill dropped him with a clean shot to the chest before he could fire. Our ammunition was dwindling. The tension was unbearable, but we weren't giving up.
"Mike, cover us,"
the lieutenant shouted, tossing us extra ammo from a crate near the door. The battle dragged on, exhausting and relentless. We exchanged fire with the Germans, desperately holding our positions. Bullets hissed through the air, ricocheting off trees and whizzing past our heads. They were pressing from both flanks, forcing us to scramble back and forth to cover ourselves. Adrenaline pounded in my temples, and my fingers were numb from the cold and the tension. We knew they outnumbered us, and if they broke through, it would be over. Then everything changed. From deep in the forest came that roar, loud, guttural, inhuman. It wasn't just a sound. It felt like it tore through your chest, leaving you frozen. The gunfire ceased as both sides stopped in their tracks. Then, from the shadows of the trees, something massive erupted into the open. It was him, the werewolf. A black, hunched figure resembling a wolf, but far larger, with elongated limbs, bloodied claws, and glowing red eyes. Its teeth gleamed in the moonlight as it let out another bone-rattling growl before charging at the nearest German soldier. At first, it felt like a nightmare. The Germans screamed, firing their rifles and machine guns at the beast, but it only seemed to enrage it further. The werewolf lunged, knocking one man to the ground, its jaws crushing his throat with a sickening crunch. Blood sprayed across the snow. Another soldier fired wildly, but the creature turned on him, throwing him against a tree like a rag doll. We stood frozen, horrified spectators to the carnage. The lieutenant snapped us out of it with a shout.
"What the hell? Fire! Everyone, fire on that thing!"
We opened up with everything we had. Bullets tore through the air, striking the creature, but it didn't flinch. It finished mauling its victim and turned to us, dropping the lifeless body into the blood-stained snow. Its eyes, those blazing red eyes, locked onto us. It growled, a deep, resonant sound that made the ground feel like it was trembling beneath our boots. "Keep firing!" I yelled, squeezing the trigger of my Thompson in a frantic burst. The rounds ripped into its flesh, tearing through fur and muscle. But it kept advancing, unfazed. The remaining Germans broke and scattered, abandoning the fight, leaving us face to face with the monster.
Dear God, it won't die.
Thomas shouted as he reloaded his machine gun. Suddenly, Mike bolted upright.
"Cover me!"
he yelled, making a break for the jeep.
"Mike, you idiot, get back here!"
Bill shouted, but Mike was already gone, disappearing behind the vehicle. We kept firing, trying to slow the beast down. Its massive paws crunched through the snow as it closed in, snarling and baring its fangs. Its grotesque face twisted in a snarl, and its claws glinted in the dim light like knives. Then Mike returned. In his hands was the flamethrower we'd recovered from the German cave.
"Get back!"
he shouted, running toward us. We parted, still firing to keep the creature at bay. Mike leveled the flamethrower, aimed, and pulled the trigger. A torrent of fire erupted, roaring into the night. The blaze lit up the snowy field, the heat scorching our faces even from a distance. The flames engulfed the beast and it let out a deafening howl, this time of pain. It thrashed wildly, clawing at the ground, but the fire consumed it. Its fur ignited, and its skin bubbled and cracked under the heat. We kept shooting, determined to finish it off. The werewolf staggered forward, managing a few more steps before collapsing to its knees. Its roars turned to ragged gasps, and finally, it fell silent. The massive body crumpled into the snow, smoke rising from its charred remains. The acrid stench of burnt flesh and fur filled the air. We stood there in stunned silence, breathing heavily. The lieutenant was the first to speak. Is it dead?" I cautiously approached the smoldering corpse, my weapon still trained on it. The creature lay motionless. The combined firepower of bullets and flames had finally brought it down. "We did it," I muttered, though I could hardly believe it myself. As we gathered around the lifeless body of the monster, no one spoke. This wasn't a victory to celebrate. It was a horrifying encounter with something that shouldn't exist. We felt no triumph, only exhaustion, fear, and a strange sense of relief. Even in death, the beast was terrifying. Its charred form, a grim reminder of the nightmare we'd just endured. I tried to process what had happened. Part of me refused to believe it was real. Maybe it was the war, the stress, the sleepless nights, but the smell of burned flesh and the grotesque figure lying before us was a stark reminder. This was no illusion. The rest of the night passed without incident, but none of us could sleep. We sat in silence, staring into the darkness, ears straining for any sound. In my mind, I kept wondering, how many of these things were there? Where had they come from? And was this truly over? The next morning, we scoured the forest for the remaining Germans. We found them huddled in an abandoned cabin. There were 5 of them, and they didn't resist when we approached. They looked broken, their faces pale and their eyes hollow. They raised their hands in surrender, saying nothing as we bound them. One of them, a young man with trembling lips, kept muttering, "It was a wolf, a wolf." By midday, reinforcements arrived, several jeeps and trucks, and officers of a rank far higher than we were used to seeing. We recounted everything, from the German attack to the encounter with the werewolf. Their faces remained stoic, but their eyes betrayed disbelief. That changed when they saw the creature's remains. Suddenly, everything shifted. By evening, more personnel had arrived, scientists, military experts, and even men in plain clothes who were clearly not part of the army. They collected everything: the records, the equipment, and the scorched remains of the beast. We were debriefed extensively, repeating our story until it felt like a grim fairy tale. But we knew it was real. Then came the non-disclosure agreements. "This is a matter of national security," one of the plainclothes officers said coldly. "No one, not even your families, can know about this." We were reassigned to the rear shortly afterward. No explanations, no further involvement. It was clear we were expendable witnesses to something far beyond the scope of our mission. After the war, we rarely spoke of it. The memories were too heavy, too unreal. But when we did gather over whiskey and shared silence, the story always resurfaced. Each of us remembered every detail. We debated what it had been, a scientific abomination, a supernatural terror, or something beyond human comprehension. But one thing we all agreed on, it was the most terrifying thing we had ever faced in the war. And we prayed we'd never face it again. Story 2. My grandfather, a young British infantryman, went off to war at just 19 years old. Like many young men, he dreamed of adventure, of distant horizons, the warm sands of Tunisia, or the shadowy streets of Italy. But fate had other plans. Instead of exotic lands, he found himself almost at home, in the quiet, snowy landscape of Switzerland. It seemed like a peaceful place for a war. Yet Switzerland, with its carefully guarded neutrality, held far more dangers than anyone could imagine. Understanding the situation my grandfather faced is key to this story. Switzerland, like a skilled tightrope walker, balanced between the interests of the Allies and the Axis powers. Its alpine valleys became an alluring place for both sides, strategically important, and a last quiet refuge. As the Nazis began to show aggression, Britain, sensing the growing tension, sent troops to support the Swiss. But it wasn't aid in the usual sense. The Swiss government preferred a strategy of retreat, avoiding open war on their borders. That's how British soldiers, including my grandfather, ended up in remote corners of the Swiss Alps. The winter of 1943 caught them in a tiny village of barely 500 people. The location was difficult to access, which was considered an advantage. There was little chance of a sudden German attack, but it was also a disadvantage. Communication with the outside world was limited, and when the December blizzards came, the last threads of connection disappeared with the wind and snow. The village seemed to dissolve into a white silence. Blizzard after blizzard swept through, filling every corner with snowy desolation. It was as if nature itself had decided to erase the place from the map. Radio communication went dead, roads vanished, and my grandfather's unit was left alone with the harsh winter and an oppressive quiet. In that isolation, the village began to feel like a forgotten corner of the world, where past and present blended into a strange, snowy dance. And it was here, in this cold and silent place, that something began. Something my grandfather would recall with a shiver even years later. So they were trapped. The snow-covered Swiss village had become a frozen, isolated world. There was no communication with the outside. The roads were buried under meters of snow, and the lines of communication were as silent as if they'd never existed. The captain ordered the soldiers to stick to the plan, maintain their defense no matter what. The orders were clear, but no one in that village understood what they were defending. Or maybe, from whom. The weeks dragged on. The snow kept falling, adding its weight to the heaviness in the air. Trees, stripped bare by the winter winds, stood like broken bones on the mountain slopes. The town lingered in eternal twilight, wedged between two massive ridges. At this time of year, the sun only appeared for a couple of hours, bathing the world in a brief, grim, golden glow, before disappearing behind the mountains. In those moments, even the spirit grew heavy, as if the winter not only wrapped the village in its icy grip, but seeped into the hearts of everyone there. One evening, my grandfather and a few comrades were sitting in the village bar, a place where the dim light of kerosene lamps mingled with the smell of cheap beer and quiet despair. They were trying to pass the time when a group of locals approached them. One of the villagers in particular seemed especially agitated. His face was red, his lips trembling, and his eyes burned with a mix of fear and anger. The locals spoke in German, which the British soldiers, of course, didn't understand. One of the villagers, clearly unused to foreigners, began shouting broken words in English. "Where you take children." His voice was angry, but beneath the anger lay terror, something cold and bone-deep. Thankfully, one of the soldiers, a man named Wilson, spoke fluent German. He stepped in as a translator. At first, the conversation was a jumble of panicked words and fragments of sentences, but gradually a picture began to emerge. After several tense minutes, during which voices rose and fell, Wilson turned to my grandfather and the others. "They're saying children are disappearing. Several kids from the village have gone missing. They want us to do something." The words hung in the air like icy breath. The soldiers were silent, exchanging uneasy glances. On the one hand, this was a local matter. The British Army wasn't there to meddle in such affairs. On the other hand, missing children in a tiny, frozen village. That sounded far worse than just bad news. "We're not bounty hunters," one of the men grumbled. "Let them go to the captain. He'll sort it out." And that's exactly what they did. Sent the villagers to the makeshift headquarters, the old village church, which the soldiers had turned into a barracks. The language barrier turned the discussion with the captain into an agonizing 2-hour ordeal. Awkward pauses, broken only by muttered German and Wilson's weary voice translating, filled the cold air of the church. Eventually, the captain pieced together a story that sounded both absurd and deeply unsettling. At first, it seemed like mundane village problems. When the British soldiers arrived, the locals started noticing strange disappearances. Pieces of wood vanished from sheds. Tarpaulins seemed to dissolve into thin air. It could have been minor thefts or simple forgetfulness. But as time passed, it became clear something else was going on. Valuables started disappearing from homes. One villager, a burly farmer with an impressive mustache, swore that an ancient ceremonial halberd, a family heirloom forged by his ancestors, had vanished from his mantle. And just as the village was buzzing with talk of these thefts, the unthinkable happened. A child went missing. At first, the villagers tried to rationalize it. The boy might have wandered off while playing outside. Or perhaps a wolf had taken him. Such things weren't uncommon in the mountains. But when a second child disappeared, then a third, it became clear the problem went much deeper. The man who had shouted at my grandfather in the bar turned out to be the father of 2 missing boys. He was at his breaking point. For 2 days he had searched the mountain region, assembling a group of villagers to help. They combed the forests, checked the ravines, and dug into every snowdrift, but found nothing. No signs of a struggle, no blood, nothing to indicate what had happened. It was as if the children had simply vanished into thin air. The captain listened to the story, his brow furrowed. He promised the villagers that he would take action. Soldiers would patrol the streets every night, hoping to catch the thief if it was a person or scare off a predator, if it was a wild animal. But things only got worse. On the very night the captain ordered the patrols, Private Reginald went missing. One of the soldiers had seen him step outside, saying he wanted to get some fresh air. When Reginald didn't return after 10 minutes, his comrades assumed he'd gone to the bar. But he wasn't at the bar, or anywhere else. By morning, they had searched the entire village and the surrounding area. Once again, there were no tracks, no signs, nothing. Children were one thing. Small, fragile, they could fall victim to wolves or accidents, but a grown man, a trained soldier? No one could believe that an animal had overpowered Reginald. That's when the rumors began to spread. People whispered that a monster lurked in the mountains. Something ancient. Something that had been waiting for the right moment. A creature that crept down in the night to hunt. The captain tried to maintain order among the soldiers and villagers. The nightly patrols continued but yielded no results. They didn't set traps because no one knew what they were hunting. Meanwhile, the disappearances persisted. Reginald was the only adult to vanish. The rest were children, little boys and girls between the ages of 5 and 10. By the time the 7th child went missing, the village was gripped by a terror that felt alive, like a pulsing, breathing darkness. The rumors grew louder and the sense of unease deepened. It was as if the place itself was exhaling something malevolent, as if the snow concealed not just drifts, but secrets too horrifying to uncover. More than a month passed in agonizing anticipation. Winter began its slow retreat, and spring gradually started to awaken the village from its icy grip. Yet the tension lingered. Even after Reginald's disappearance and the loss of 7 children, everything remained cloaked not just in snow, but in the oppressive darkness of the unknown. Within my grandfather's company, rumors began to swirl. Some claimed that the villagers were to blame, that driven by poverty, they had sold their children into slavery to survive. But this theory didn't hold up. The roads were still buried under snow, and even the most seasoned guide wouldn't have been able to leave the village. The first days of the thaw felt like a breath of fresh air. The grimy white crust cracked, revealing darkened soil beneath, and with each passing day, the village seemed to inch closer to life. But it was then, on the night my grandfather was on patrol, that everything finally became clear. It was just past midnight. The moon cast a faint glow over the village streets, turning the snowdrifts into shapeless gray shadows. My grandfather and his comrades were making their rounds when they noticed something strange. A figure, gaunt, twisted, almost unnatural, was standing by the window of one of the houses, peering inside. At first the patrol went unnoticed, but when my grandfather called out, the figure jerked around. For a moment its face was illuminated by the moonlight, pale, elongated, almost inhuman. Then it bolted, sprinting toward the edge of the village. The soldiers gave chase. They shouted, ordering it to stop, but the figure moved with uncanny speed, as if it knew every corner and crevice of the terrain. The thawing snow beneath their boots was treacherously slick, turning the pursuit into an agonizing struggle. Soon, the chase led them to the village outskirts, where the snow was still deep. There, the figure seemed to vanish. But no, it hadn't disappeared. Upon closer inspection, they realized it had leapt into a snowdrift, where a hidden entrance gaped like the mouth of a makeshift cave. My grandfather and the others surrounded the opening. Someone shouted, commanding whoever was inside to come out. The response was a gunshot, then another. The sound fractured the cold night air, and without hesitation, the soldiers returned fire. Rifle shots cracked through the silence until suddenly everything went quiet. For what felt like hours, though it was only minutes, the patrol stood frozen in tense silence. No one dared to make a move. Finally, one of the soldiers volunteered to crawl inside. With his pistol drawn, he inched into the dark. When he emerged, his face was as pale as the snow, his eyes wide with horror. My grandfather, his hand trembling as he held a lantern, leaned down and looked inside. The light fell upon Reginald's lifeless eyes, their missing comrade. He lay on his side, motionless, a bloody hole in his chest. But that wasn't the worst of it. Behind him, the soldiers saw something that made their blood run cold. 7 small bodies, children, lay scattered in grotesque disarray. Some had been partially consumed. In the corner, the ceremonial halberd from the farmer's mantle rested, its blade stained with dried blood. The truth was far more horrific than anyone could have imagined. Reginald, broken by isolation, the cold, and perhaps his own inner demons, had descended into madness. He had been the one creeping through the village, abducting children, killing them, and bringing them to this vile den. The halberd had become his weapon, the snow his cover, and the children his prey. When the patrol returned to the village, no one could speak a word. That night, the soldiers learned that true horror is not the enemy on the battlefield, nor the predator in the forest, but the monster that hides among your own.